So we found out that love is not easily angered. So I know you guys have been talking about discovering love on quite a few Sunday evenings, and now we come to the topic of anger and how it relates to love. So I thought I'd start with the tail end of this text just to change up the pace. So we're going to talk a little bit about anger. Now you'd think that with a guy that used to be participating in road rage and still kills chickens for fun. But if you really listen, the chicken thing does relate to the 9 children. I do feed my children, so it does tie together. Now, there's a couple pieces to anger we're going to talk about tonight. One is there's good anger and there's bad anger. And then we're just going to find out what is anger anyway, because there is some really cute things about anger. And then we'll throw in a couple conclusions. So on the topic of good anger, we read in Psalm 7, it says that God judges the righteous and God is angry with the wicked. And then we read in 1 Kings 11 that the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord. So the Lord was angry on that topic. And then in Mark 3, Jesus said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out and he was healed. And then the classic story, John 2:13-16, the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers were sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. So that was the emotion of anger there as well. Now, good anger, or even righteous anger, can be distinguished along with some trademark flags. For we need to be very careful not to characterize all our blow-ups to be righteous. Our personal filters of judgment often favor not condemning ourselves. Using biblical criteria, some of the flags are: first, it must be a reaction to actual sin. There must be a biblically defined true evil present. Second, the anger focuses on God's and all that is God's, not on me, my supposed rights and concerns. And lastly, the anger is accompanied by other good qualities like self-control, kind, brotherly. It is not ranting, it's not hurtful, it's not self-pity, it's not despairing. In short, is your anger a Christ-like anger? 1 Samuel 11. Some of the key points here was when Nahash the Ammonite made a point of saying to the men of Jabesh, if you just give up, we'll just gouge out your right eye, and then you'll be ours, and we'll let you go. Seemed quite simple, but then in verse 6 is when Saul heard the words, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger. And in a couple days, he managed to round up 330,000 guys ready to fight, after threatening to chop up their oxen. And then, during the last watch of the night, they broke into the camp of the Ammonites, and he slaughtered them so viciously that there was no 2 of them found together the next day. That's pretty incredible. So when you read this, the definition of righteous anger, it's very apparent, because Saul was the king of God's people, and he rightly burned with anger. But then there's the bad anger. In Genesis 4, verse 5-8, we read, "But for Cain and his offering, he, the Lord, had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it.' Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and were in the field. Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him." Another one is Proverbs. Proverbs contains some really nice nuggets. "A hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger quiets contention." And the similar text, "A man of wrath stirs up strife, and one given to anger causes much transgression." And then a nice one for Proverbs 30, "For pressing milk produces curds, pressing the nose produces blood, and pressing anger produces strife." But is it just anger that this text warns us about? Since most good things come in lists, here's a bunch. We are not to be touchy, easily provoked, sarcastic, fretful, resentful, suspicious, or oversensitive with our feelings. Makes much of our time on texting and Facebook seem like it's being exposed. For God is patiently at work in us. Where is our need to be uncharitable towards our brother? One good exposition on this also asked if we were given to anger towards each other in heaven. What a thought. Bickering and fighting on the streets of heaven. Never. In this epistle, Paul spends quite a bit of time talking about with the church about lawsuits. And 1 Corinthians 6, he goes on at length about it and says, if anyone of you has a dispute with another, do you dare take it in front of the ungodly? Or do you not know that the Lord's people will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? And he goes on at length all the way to verse 8, talking about how that strife and the lawsuits against each other were not the responses he was looking for. So then I thought, how many lawsuits are directly connected with anger? When I watch YouTube clips of Russian drivers demonstrating their pugilistic abilities with another driver, it's an overwhelming display of anger, and I'm sure there's a little bit of potato vodka in there too. But the shallow humor of watching this is tempered by the thoughts of it drives the immediate need to harm another person's property, to rip off their mirror, batter his face, and climb back in your car. With that lack of control, how grossly dysfunctional it is. The characteristics of relationship building and a true concern for the welfare of your brother are not very evident. With this anger, there is little regard for respect or putting yourself in your brother's shoes. So how does love and anger mix? Love makes you able to see into the heart of the one who is harassing you. Love sees the anxiety, the fear, the pain, the defensive behavior of the person who is controlled by anger. Love gives you the patience and kindness to endure the provocation of the person who is self-seeking and who wants to be in control. Love pities the person who is out of control and is making a fool of himself. Love bites his tongue so he does not say something he might regret later. Love listens to what is not being said, what is behind what is being said. Love gives you the words to respond when you're confronted with bad temper. Jonah too struggled with anger, combined with a whole bunch of hate. He really, really, really wanted to sit and see Nineveh absolutely destroyed. Jonah is just like us, you and me. He fooled himself into thinking that his cause was the Lord's cause, not the other way around, that the Lord's cause ought to be his cause. And so he confirmed himself in his anger. He became so involved in his anger, he forgot he was doing the Lord's work. So what is anger? In Matthew 5, verse 22, but we'll read the verses 21 to 23. It says, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. So we just heard that there's a parallel between murder and anger. But let's be careful not to get carried away. This text does specifically instruct us in our communication with our fellow believers. But the urgency and clarity of how God views our anger equates it to murder. In effect, your anger is showing that the faults of your brother, whom God has said belongs to him with all the faults and everything, is not good enough for you and is presently under your skin and ticking you off. So anger also has some interesting characteristics. And I cut and pasted this off one of those weird medical sites. And it says, like other emotions, anger is experienced in our bodies as well as in our minds. In fact, there's a complex series of physiological events that occurs as we become angry. Emotions, more or less, begin inside two almond-shaped structures in our brains, which are called the amygdalae. The amygdalae is part of the brain responsible for identifying threats to our well-being and for sending out an alarm when threats are identified that results in us taking steps to protect ourselves. The amygdala is so efficient at warning us about threats that it gets us reacting before the cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for thought and judgment, is able to check on the reasonableness of our reaction. In other words, our brains are wired in such a way as to influence us to act before we can even properly consider the consequences of our actions. This is not an excuse for behaving badly. People can and do control their aggressive impulses, and you can too with some practice. Instead, it means that learning to manage anger properly is a skill that has to be learned instead of something we're born knowing how to do instinctively. As you become angry, your body's muscles tense up, Inside your brain, neurotransmitter chemicals known as catecholamines are released, causing you to experience a burst of energy lasting up to several minutes. This burst of energy is behind the common angry desire to take immediate protective action. At the same time, your heart rate accelerates, your blood pressure rises, your rate of breathing increases, your face may flush as increased blood enters your limbs and extremities in preparation for physical action. Your attention narrows and becomes locked onto the target of your anger. Soon you can pay attention to nothing else. In quick succession, additional brain neurotransmitters and hormones, among them adrenaline and noradrenaline, are released, which trigger a lasting state of arousal. You're now ready to fight. Well, oranges, reds, and camouflage, you let me down. But some of the pieces that stuck out for me is that the amygdala is telling the cortex, do this before the cortex even understands what it's doing. So if you think about it, in the light of what we know to be God's truth, that's a scary thought. If your mind isn't fully prepared and your soul is not fully filled with the love of God. And it says here too, in the secular piece, people can and do control their aggressive impulses, and you can too with some practice. So it might be easier just to study God's word than to practice getting angry and then teaching yourself how to turn it off. So, I don't know. And I like the piece. Your attention narrows and locked on the target of anger, and you can pay attention to nothing else. So that's some pretty fearsome stuff going on. On the easily portion of our text, some have written that the word was added by King James when he wrote the KJV, because at times he could be an explosive individual. So to have it, love is not angered, would have put pressure on the king, who agreed to have the Bible translated and set 50 top scholars on the work. However, that's not supported by text elsewhere in the Bible, which prove easily must be maintained in the text. So we also saw that the easily portion is important to leave opportunity for righteousness to also be expressed. But let us not allow our self-absorption and perfectionism to use this small entryway as an excuse on our road to self-indulgent anger. A loving person does not allow themselves to be easily provoked, pushed, prodded, or poked into anger. So in conclusions, we consider how James wrote in James 1:19-20. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. God also instructs us how to mend conflict, an important part of this discussion. In Matthew 5, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. So God is literally saying to his people, gird your loins, saddle your camel, and directly approach your brother and resolve the issue now. Then come back and resume your worship. Pause everything, even the number one task of living a life of worship. For your worship, when you have anger in your heart, is not acceptable. Fix the issue. Stop the anger and become full of love. The power of I'm sorry. Practice repairing relationships that have old hurts or old anger. Practice saying, I'm sorry. Take ownership and begin the process to heal. Pray for an abundance of wisdom and patience, for with them there will be little space in your hearts and minds for bad anger to grow. Anger cannot rest in the bosom where love reigns. And also Romans 5:5, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit, which has been given to us. Thank you.